Alright, so finally, this latest chapter of My Hero Academia has laid to rest one of the most popular fan theories out there. One we never really subscribed to here on Plot Armor, not only because of a lack of evidence, but because of the danger it served to pose to the continuity of the entire series. And admittedly, the possibility of its fruition did get a little too close for comfort towards the end there, but thankfully in the end, things aren't nearly as convoluted. In the previous chapter, after apprehending and passing the villain Muscular over to the police, Deku would make his way elsewhere and back to All Might. It was then revealed that Deku was utilizing an American support item that All Might had procured for him just before the country's borders closed, the likes of which were nearly identical to the one featured in the first movie, but certainly capable of handling a lot more despite only being samples. From here, All Might received a call from Hawks as Best Jeanist and Endeavor confronted a villain behind him. The fear was that Shigaraki and All For One would be able to re-enter the fight well prepared, which would quite obviously spell disaster, and so their approach was to be rather protective and offensive in this instance. However, flashing back to Deku's time in the hospital prior to discharge, it would be revealed that despite an ongoing fear that he would lose use of his limbs if exerted to their utmost limits due to internal damage, in this case, he had managed to limit said damage to almost exclusively the external sort. This difference being largely thanks to the compression of Black Whip. At the time of the internal diagnosis, Deku was at about 5% capability with One For All as compared to what is now 45%. Now mind you, he wasn't completely out of the woods just yet when it came to the degradation of his body, so at the very least he still needs to adopt the proper precautions. From here, however, at the request of his mother, All Might would reveal the truth of her son's quirk. With this, Deku would express his reluctance to return to school, refusing to endanger anyone else, now saying goodbye to his beloved mother, all while reassuring her that he will be back. And All Might too would join him as to honor the promise he had once made. Just before departure, Deku would deliver the message of Shimurnana to Gran Torino, who was still recovering, and be granted what remains of his signature cowl, thus commencing the greatest modern day heroic team up. With this one, we would open up to a rainy scene as several people clung onto illegal support items. They had all begun to engage with a rather tall individual, one that would plead and cry for them to stop. She cried out that she wasn't a monster, that she was just scared. However, the paranoia of these people was too great as one would refuse to lower his blaster of what may be assumed to be condensed water and open fire. However, just then, Deku would leap into action and defend the civilian. He'd come to de-escalate the situation, calling for everyone to just calm down. It was raining and tensions were high, but who they were confronting was most certainly not a villain. The group would firstly hesitate, but eventually make their way elsewhere, making one final comment of their suspicion, a signifier of how precarious situations can become when untrained individuals take it upon themselves to dole out justice. This person was late for evacuation. Their location was one of the better places to be in when the crisis first started, and so they figured it would be alright for them to stay at home until things sorted themselves out. However, things only seemed to get worse and worse, and so they figured they should make their way to a hero school, what are now designated evacuation sites. She was so fearful of running into a conflict that she just began to run as fast as she could at the first sign of a person. Now Deku is fast here, alarmingly so. Before this person could even realize, he had already gone up and retrieved her umbrella for her. Now this umbrella had flown up at the start of the conflict, and this may not seem like much, but for him to have firstly known of an umbrella to begin with despite him not even being involved in the situation just yet, then lift off with Float to retrieve it, and make it back before she could even notice he was gone, while even the slightest footfall should in theory be heard on account of the pooling water, is just ridiculous. Oh, and he didn't miss a word that she said, as he was able to easily respond that everyone else is likely just as scared. She would then ask him if things would ever go back to normal, which he would confirm as a car would come along as he began to say farewell. And would you believe it, this vehicle belonged to none other than All Might, as that symbol of peace money is no joke. He'd emerge immediately asking if Deku was alright like a concerned parent, the very same thing he had asked of Deku in the previous chapter. All Might is clearly on edge and rather fearful for his young protege's safety. But again, the foreshadowing of an inverse situation is to us too great to ignore. However, Deku was just fine and would simply ask for All Might to take the civilian to the nearest evacuation center. And imagine meeting All Might like this. But before Deku could properly take off, All Might, being the concerned parent that he is, would make sure that his little boy is getting a solid meal in at the end of the day, as he would present to him a bento wrapped in rabbit print cloth. Fitting. Deku would immediately express his gratitude, but All Might's expression was stone cold, that if Deku doesn't eat immediately, the food will get cold. What an interesting dynamic these two now have. From here, Deku would find himself atop a building as he would overlook the city. The visage of Lariat would then appear and do the very same, commenting on how terrible it is that things have regressed to how they were during his lifetime, a time of indiscriminate profiling. From here, however, we would yet again be provided with information we are all rather familiar with as is. And if there is any critique I could provide to what have otherwise been some pretty fantastic chapters to follow in the wake of the war arc, it would be the ever so frequent recap of prior events and abundantly clear concepts. We know that society is broken. We know the danger Shigaraki and All for One pose, and we know that Deku is the only one who can truly stop them. But in the last dozen chapters or so, we have heard it all a few too many times for my liking. However, to follow this, we would pick back up where chapter 305 ended off, as the founder would call upon the second and third possessors of the quirk to lend their aid to Deku, thus providing their power and collective knowledge to their successor. But with this, there was an awkward pause across the board, a pause that would be broken by the rambunctious nature of Lariat, who would call for Deku to get used to everyone else's quirks, likely not including himself in the equation, as Deku has already had plenty of time to make Black Whip his own. He would then go on to further specify that he should get acquainted with Danger Sense and Smokescreen specifically, and with them both being sort of cautionary quirks, it makes sense. But as this conversation would go on, the third possessor would speak for the very first time, not to the collective, but specifically to the first. He would speak of their time period being the absolute worst, a time when All for One was at the height of his power and threatened to take over the entire world, with a hold over others so strong that many had no idea at all. The future for them looked very bleak, and so a resistance was formed, the leader of which being the second possessor of the quirk, and it was thanks to their combined efforts that the threat was quelled to an extent. The second two would then speak. In order to stop the founder's brother, so many lives were sacrificed. He would then question if the founder could reasonably expect them to rally behind such a naive child who sought to save his very enemy. And the founder too would acknowledge Deku's foolishness, but it was thanks to such foolishness that One for All came to be in the first place, as these two, despite being enemies of All for One, saved his brother regardless, and even extended a helping hand, that if they hadn't done so, this power would have never come to be what it is today, and they would have no chance against All for One, a concept the second himself likely realized already. He then asked if the founder truly believes Deku to be the savior they need, as again, the founder would express his faith. And with this, in the present, Deku unpacked his meal as the visages of the past wielders would all come to his side, as the second would proclaim that it's full speed ahead from here, and that was the chapter. Wow, this was phenomenal, and there is still a bit to unpack there that makes it so much crazier. So subtle inclusion, but it seems as though the semi-forged room that they are all in is a replica of the room All for One once kept his brother in, which is pretty neat. Now clearly, as I vaguely mentioned with the beginning of the video, the second and third wielders of the quirk are not Bakugo and Kirishima, which I am so grateful for. Time travel is way too convoluted. A simple story like My Hero Academia absolutely does not need something like that, and so thankfully we are not dealing with anything of the sort, and instead have been presented with whole new characters that I would love to better know as time goes on. Now moving on, this could be a case of faulty translation here, but the denotion of speed with the second user's final line certainly piques my interest, simply because of the umbrella situation we spoke of earlier on. It may be minute, but the distinction of this umbrella is enough to raise a brow at the very least. This is way too fast, even for what we have seen previously of Deku, and to do so without missing a beat of the conversation is alarming. And so we could very well be dealing with a speed quirk of some sort. And although it is not something that we have specified or predicted in a video prior, it does certainly abide by the criteria we have established for our findings previously. These same criteria we had used to uncover Danger Sense prior to its proper reveal. Now, the implications of such a quirk are absolutely staggering, and mind you, a truly remarkable quirk like this is to me reasonably substantiated by the fact that the second and third wielders, as opposed to all others to follow, were not yet subject to All for One's purge. Indeed, they were present for the peak of his dominion, but remember that this was prior to his obsession with One for All that gave way for the desperation that relegated transfer to the underwhelming. Now, quite honestly, Deku has for the most part always been a fast character. Not overwhelmingly so, but fast nevertheless. But in considering this prospect, when referring back to his final blow against Muscular just recently, I can't help but be further convinced. I mean, Deku goes from a stationary standoff against the Fiend to suddenly a blurring rush surrounding him to the point of his mask beginning to fly upwards as a blow is seen on the form of Muscular mid-sentence before he can even blink, which is then concluded with this magnificent shot that shows Muscular reeling by the time Deku is already elsewhere with a trail behind him. And when he comes to the rescue of that poor civilian at the beginning of this chapter, we again see an exaggerated blur from him as he matches the speed of a damn bullet. A water one at that, but really, we're talking about hero grade support items here, so I don't imagine it's a very slow release. And even if this was a water gun you could find at Walmart, being able to leap in the way of it out of nowhere, presumably a ways away, is impressive regardless. And he does this with his whole body in an odd position as opposed to what would normally be a linear propulsion otherwise. The momentum being so great in fact that he had to grab hold of a nearby pole to recover, thus implying a bit of underdevelopment, which we may assume to be the case when it comes to the abilities so new to him. Now, a speed quirk in the possession of Deku is just all kinds of crazy because where he may lack in power when it comes to his blows, he would then be able to make up for in speed. During the war arc, when facing off against Shigaraki, at one point, the villain simply could not afford to let his guard down at all because the barrage of blows provided by Deku was just too devastating, and once again, outside of Shigaraki, most characters couldn't handle even a single sizable hit from this guy. I mean, just look at Muscular. Danger Sense and Super Speed alone are a broken combination, so to place even more abilities on top of that is just ridiculous. But hey, with the threat of Shigaraki and All for One, Deku will need all the power that he can get his hands on, so congratulations to him. And again, yet another chapter of My Hero Academia ends where one cannot reasonably predict the events of the next, so thank you Horikoshi for keeping us all on our toes with this awesome content. And hopefully you guys enjoy our content over here enough to subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on. We cover this stuff almost daily and would love to have you join the Plot Army and be a part of this incredible journey. Because when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I am Sliceable Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.